So, a sermon about the Sabbath, eh? That's neat. That's neat. After a year of fluctuating degrees of lockdown and quarantine, isn't this just the perfect time to get on top of a soapbox or inside of a pulpit and bang on about the religious mandate to rest, shaming every last one of us for not properly observing the Sabbath like our parents or our grandparents used to. Seems helpful right about now, especially to a congregation, a community, a country, a world who've been either run off their feet because they are an essential service worker, or the exact opposite. They are obeying the state of emergency order by staying home, which just means juggling work from the laptop at your kitchen table while helping kids do virtual schooling and trying to remember when was the last time you changed out of your pajama pants today, or had a shower. What better time to preach a barn burner of a sermon about how keeping the Sabbath day holy is one of the 10 Commandments. Look, I'd be all for it if I could even remember what day of the week it is anymore. A global pandemic is certainly a strange time to think about Sabbath, and yet, here we are. Which made me wonder, this time around, with this Luke 6 passage, if it's really about Sabbath at all. I mean, yes, of course it is. On the surface it is. And to that point, I'll actually give you a quick refresher about Sabbath law. But first, I need you to set aside two things. The first is that the Sabbath has anything at all to do with Sunday. You need to set that aside for a minute. And the second is that it has anything to do with going to church. Those two things, while valid, are Christian ideas which have developed over the last 2 millennia. They are important to you and to I, but they weren't even on the radar for Jesus and his companions, or the Pharisees and their companions. So once we've set aside our bias to the best of our ability, we can look at this story in its original first-century Jewish capacity. In Judaism, the Sabbath has a dual function. In the book of Exodus, the directive to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy or set apart is the second of 10 commandments chiseled by God's own hand into tablets of stone. The commandments, or 10 words, are life-giving directives to the people of God. I love how Young Children of Worship calls them the 10 best ways to live. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11 says this: "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your children or your slaves or your livestock or even the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it." In short, remember the Sabbath because you are made in the image of God, and God rested. There is something essential, something life-giving and restorative to the pattern and flow of work and rest for people, for animals, and for the planet itself. Well, then later in the book of Deuteronomy, the 10 Commandments are sort of fleshed out. Think of it like wanting to establish a bylaw and then sending it to lawyers and such to actually dig in and make the thing tangible and concrete. So in Deuteronomy, the impetus for keeping Sabbath becomes a way of remembering what it was like to live in a time and a place where there was no rest, namely when they were slaves in Egypt. The second commandment was actually like the first labor law. Don't become like the taskmasters and slave drivers of Egypt. Keep Sabbath for yourself, for your family, for your community, for your servants, for your livestock. Even your fields should lie fallow. every 7 years to give them rest from their labors of production. So far, so good. But then it sort of gets sticky because something that was meant to be life-giving to all living things becomes entrenched in identity making. And here's how that happened. You see, about 300 years before Jesus was born, Israel, like many of its neighbors, were overthrown by the Seleucids. And like some of the empires before them, they were ruthlessly tyrannical in stripping people of their culture and identity. There was no cultural mosaic in the Seleucid Empire. It was cultural genocide. Under the Seleucids, it was illegal for Jews to own a Torah, their Hebrew scriptures. It was illegal for them to have their sons circumcised. It was illegal to observe the Sabbath. It was a bad time. And like the Holocaust or the residential school system here in Canada, it had an impact that lasted for generations upon generations. Now, thankfully, the Seleucid Empire fell somewhere around 63 BCE. Well, the Roman Empire set up shop next. And while the Romans were less strict about cultural and religious identity, so long as it did not contravene the authority of Rome, Jewish people were still licking their wounds from generations of being under cruel Seleucid rule. Now, after years of having it stripped from them, when they were finally freed to practice their religion, Jews became ferociously committed to upholding practices that asserted and preserved their identity. So, understanding this should actually make us more sympathetic to the Pharisees, whose function in society was really just trying to uphold and maintain their community's Jewishness. Keeping Sabbath was a foundational way for first-century Jews of preserving and proclaiming their identity. It was something that had been taken away from them, but now they had it back, and they would cling to it with their life, never, ever taking it for granted. Keeping Sabbath, along with reading Torah, circumcising their sons, and not eating certain foods, made the Jews distinct from the society around them. So then along comes Jesus, the protagonist of the Gospels, the Son of God, the Jewish Messiah. And it looks like he's just playing fast and loose, standing by while his disciples pluck, crush, and eat heads of grain, which contravenes the Sabbath law about working. And then later, performing a healing during the mandated day of rest. But there's something going on here, because in both stories, when he's confronted, Jesus doesn't argue back about the nuances of the law. He doesn't even pull one of his, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." He simply asserts his authority over it. And then he reframes the purpose of it. So here's my theory. While Luke 6 looks like two stories about Jesus breaking Sabbath tradition, Luke 6 is actually two stories about authority and purpose. The Sabbath itself is never dismissed or devalued. Rather, exceptions to this very important practice are weighed and evaluated, like calculated risk. Who gets to deviate? And why? And this actually speaks to us in a really powerful way today. In 2021, in the midst of a global pandemic, in our Christian context. A few weeks ago, my mother drew my attention to a church in her neck of the woods who is continuing to meet in person, despite the provincial lockdown. And this isn't a small church in some rural area. It's a big church by Canadian standards, and it's just outside of a major urban center. Their argument against the government's directive to stop in-person gatherings is grounded in their interpretation of Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 to 25, which says, "And let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." In their open letter to the executive branches of Ontario and Canada, the leadership of that congregation asserts that meeting together in person is the basis of church, and thus church cannot exist without in-person gathering for worship and fellowship. Since the province-wide lockdown came into effect on Boxing Day, officials have handed out 24 charges against the members of the church's leadership. And after holding another in-person worship service last Sunday, the church leadership appeared on Wednesday in court for a contempt of court hearing where the judge made an oral finding of guilt with a written reasoning to follow. A GoFundMe page had been set up to help with the financial penalties facing the church's leaders. Prior to this past week's transgression, the goal was to fund $150,000 worth of fines. But after the contempt of court finding, those fines are likely to move into the millions of dollars. So here's the thing, folks. What happens when circumstance bumps up against tradition? What happens when science rubs up against practice? Sure, when we know better, we do better. We no longer leech people for migraines, for example. But what happens when it all clashes with our identity making and keeping? And this is what I've been thinking about and praying about while reflecting on the stories from Luke chapter 6. Because while they look like they are stories about Sabbath, they're actually stories about Jesus' authority and purpose. Jesus is Lord over Sabbath. And Sabbath is meant as a way of giving and preserving life. In these stories from Luke, Jesus is accused of breaking the Sabbath, but the truth is that he is honoring it in the truest sense. "I ask you," he says, "is it lawful to do good or do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or destroy it?" You see, the choice that Jesus is offering is not between doing something and doing nothing. That's not what he's saying. The choice is between doing good or doing harm. There is more than one way to dishonor the Sabbath. Jesus is attempting to state his commitment to the tradition while advocating, embodying change. Knox, I recognize that this has been a hellish year for all of us, for so many reasons, and it continues to be hard in 2021. A seemingly endless lockdown with rules and restrictions that make our day-to-day life lonely and frustrating and isolating, but which don't seem to go far enough to significantly stop the viral spread. And while I would love to flout the fact that the leadership of Knox Oakville has held fast to its commitment to restrict in-person gatherings for worship, I know that it has come at a cost to each of you as individuals and to all of us as a body. This hasn't been easy, but it has been right. And though it looks like inaction, like the Christians of Knox Oakville have given up meeting together, I assure you we have not. We have looked at the choice that Jesus presented in Luke 6. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it? And we have said, no, it is not lawful to threaten life. That is not how Sabbath is kept. That is not how God is worshipped. That is not how creation is honored. I remember catching heat from some folks a few years ago for making the executive decision to close a church on a Sunday where there was a severe winter storm. I remember saying to the ministry team, if I keep the church open, people will risk their lives to come to worship because they believe that's what faithfulness looks like. We need to decide whether to allow that risk or to remove the possibility of injury and death. Again, I ask you, is it lawful, Jesus says, to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it? If one person had lost their life on the icy roads or grievously injured themselves walking on treacherous sidewalks, would we have been honoring the Sabbath? The answer is no. We would have been putting tradition and ritual ahead of life. Sabbath was not made for creation. Creation was made for Sabbath. And Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is Lord over the Sabbath. And Sabbath was made for God's beloved creation. The purpose of Sabbath is to be life-giving. Sabbath has nothing to do with a calendar day or packed pews. It is a posture of heart that recognizes we are made in the image of a creating Creator who demonstrated the necessity of rest in the rhythm of life. And it is a way of living in the world that refuses to make slaves out of ourselves, each other, animals, or the planet. That is the purpose of Sabbath. Meeting in person for the purpose of worship during a global pandemic is not life-giving. It is life-threatening. If we met on a Sunday and one person contracted COVID-19 from doing so and subsequently lost their life, or spread it to a loved one who lost their life, we would be in contempt, not only of provincial law, but of Sabbath law. In Luke chapter 6, his disciples were hungry, and a man had a withered hand. And Jesus said, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or destroy it? Embedded in this chapter are timeless themes of risk and resistance, disruption and health and stress and meeting basic needs. And these themes resonate with all of us who are weary from making really hard decisions and facing disagreement and conflict and questions with no easy answers and no foreseeable end in sight. And right in the middle of the bleakest month after a terrible and frightening year, at the opening of another year that really isn't looking much better, Jesus reminds us of his authority and his grace and his gift of life. The Sabbath is a gift meant for renewal and rest. Sabbath was made for creation. It is meant as a means to love God, love self, and love neighbor. Like justice, Sabbath is personal, but it is also very communal. These past 10 months, we have learned to live that beautiful hymn that says the church is not a building, the church is not a steeple, the church is not a resting place, the church is a people. We have never given up meeting as a church. We do so virtually, and we do so in small groups outdoors and through emails and phone calls and cards in the mail and text messages. And you know who has been able to use our building? Anonymous groups, like AA, who really do need to meet together. People for whom, especially right now, it is life or death. Church, we have gotten out of our building to preserve life, and we have made our building available to preserve life. Well done. Well done, well done. Luke 6, with the hungry disciples and the man with the withered hand, names the needs of others to do good and to preserve life as the criteria for choosing to act differently than before. And so in the months to come, churches like ours, churches everywhere, will continue to face a myriad of choices about suspending and restarting and continuing or changing practices that our communities have had for generations. Asking ourselves, which approach would preserve the lives of our neighbors and can help guide us forward? And so let us take stock, siblings in Christ. If there is to be any action on the Sabbath, may it never be for harm or destruction, but for the feeding and healing of the world. And if we manage that, well, then we'll be living the words of the hymn, that they will know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. To God be all the glory. Amen.